Zombies are stupid and slow.
What? Did you just say zombies?
When it comes to zombie games, few franchises are as iconic as Dead Rising. Of course, there's Resident Evil, House of the Dead, and a couple of other standout zombie franchises, but Dead Rising is just built different. Where most of these franchises lean into the horror, the Dead Rising franchise has always leaned the opposite way. While Dead Rising was a pretty clear nod to Dawn of the Dead, its satirical nature and its take on culture at the time of its release made it an absolute standout. So much so that it launched a franchise spanning almost 2 decades, and while not everything in the franchise lit the world on fire, and some things you didn't even know existed, it is worth diving back into the past 18 years of this Capcom classic and looking at the history of the Dead Rising franchise. August 8th, 2006. Audiences are introduced to the photojournalist and soon-to-be legendary zombie slayer, Frank West. But how exactly did Dead Rising become what it was? That story is actually pretty interesting. In an interview with 1UP, Mega Man and Dead Rising creator Keiji Inafune actually revealed that Dead Rising was initially supposed to be a sequel to the 2005 action-adventure game Shadow of Rome. However, they decided to change this to appeal to a modern-day Western audience, thus ushering in the zombie apocalypse in a mall. This decision would prove to be very successful, with the game receiving favorable reviews from critics all around, and by the end of 2006, Capcom would report that Dead Rising had sold 1 million copies worldwide. But what made Dead Rising so special and so different from Capcom's other hit zombie franchise, Resident Evil? Well, there were many things. Dead Rising was a fresh take on zombie games at the time. Its sandbox style of gameplay gave players the freedom to explore a vast mall and use almost every item imaginable to fight the zombie hordes. Its comical style was also a nice change of pace to the typical horror themes associated with zombie games at the time. The story itself being linked to a real-time mechanic, where players had a set number of in-game hours to complete the story, added a sense of urgency that kept players on their toes. And even the protagonist wasn't just your average run-of-the-mill hero type. Frank West would actually be a far cry from many of Capcom's typical young, attractive protagonists at the time. And that was actually the point. In an interview with Engadget, Keiji Inafune said that they wanted to make a more rough, tough, and gritty character for the Western market, and said that he was given specific directive to make Frank ugly and to make him fat. This decision would ultimately help to make Frank a more grounded character who borders the lines of the anti-hero, with his own goals and aspirations to rekindle his dying career. Frank West's transformation through the story of Dead Rising not only helped add to the sandbox nature of Dead Rising's anything is possible design, but reaffirmed that this was not your typical zombie game. In the end, Dead Rising would prove to be a massive success for Capcom and help launch the series into an almost 2-decade-long franchise, not even mentioning Dead Rising's most recent remaster, solidifying it as one of the greatest zombie games of all time. With Dead Rising being such a huge success, it was an obvious choice that a sequel would ensue. Dead Rising 2 was officially announced in February of 2009 and would release in September of 2010. Set 5 years after the first Dead Rising game, Dead Rising 2 would include an all-new location, new characters, and many new and improved gameplay features. One of the biggest new features that would be included is the addition of the combo weapon system, which would allow players to take a multitude of weapons and combine them to create some pretty gnarly zombie killing tools. Additionally, the game would launch with both multiplayer and co-op features, and would be the first time that players could band together to save the world from these zombie hordes. As for the story, Dead Rising 2 follows the protagonist Chuck Green, who is a former motocross champion with a pretty haunting past. Between the events of Dead Rising and Dead Rising 2, there are a number of zombie outbreaks, with one of the big ones being the Las Vegas outbreak. These events are detailed pretty heavily in the Dead Rising comic series titled A Road to Fortune, which actually came out after Dead Rising 2. During this comic series, we learn that Chuck Green's wife is bitten and in turn infects their daughter, which is a key driving factor to Chuck's actions throughout the events of the Fortune City outbreak shown in Dead Rising 2 and up until the events of Dead Rising 3. While Chuck's character arc throughout the ongoing series of Dead Rising is pretty spectacular, he would somehow fall short in fans' eyes to Dead Rising 1's protagonist, Frank West, which could have been attributed to Chuck being closer to the prototypical hero character as opposed to the flaws that we grew to love in Frank West. Frank was actually so beloved at this point that we would even see him return in the Dead Rising 2 DLC, Case West, which would team both Frank and Chuck together to investigate the link between Phenotrans and Fortune City. Additionally, this would even inspire Dead Rising 2 Off the Record, which was a non-canon reimagining of the events of Dead Rising 2, but this time playing as Frank West instead of Chuck Green. However, Off the Record would receive mostly mixed reviews, with many criticizing the game for being too similar to Dead Rising 2. When all was said and done, Dead Rising 2 and all of the content surrounding it was a huge step for the franchise, adding tons of new features and narrative depth to the series. Dead Rising 2 would go on to receive generally favorable reviews, with Capcom announcing over 2.2 million copies sold worldwide by February of 2011. With Dead Rising 2 being another home run for Capcom, development started on Dead Rising 3 with promises on some more content that would help bridge the gap narratively between Dead Rising 2 and Dead Rising 3. While Dead Rising 2 was released on both PlayStation and Xbox at launch, Dead Rising 3 released on November 22, 2013 on Xbox One exclusively, but received a PC release on September 5, 2014. Dead Rising 3 also featured a ton of gameplay improvements, such as a simpler crafting system, new combo vehicles, and the ability to save anywhere. And it could even render 3 times as many zombies on screen due to Xbox One's hardware enhancements. Narratively, the events of Dead Rising 3 follow yet another new protagonist named Nick Ramos, and takes place 10 years after the events of Dead Rising 2 in the fictional city of Los Perdidos, California. During the events of Dead Rising 3, Nick is bitten by a zombie, but actually finds out that he is immune to the virus due to experiments that were done on him by Dead Rising 1's antagonist Carlito Keyes when Nick was just a boy. All in all, the storyline for Dead Rising 3 proved to be just okay, with a few shining moments, but the real star of the game would reside in its fun gameplay. It received generally positive reviews from critics, and by January 2014, Dead Rising 3 had sold 1.2 million copies. This would set a record as the best-selling Xbox One game of all time. However, by the conclusion of Dead Rising 3, Nick is able to escape Los Perdidos and distribute a cure to the zombie virus worldwide, which would seemingly be the end of the Dead Rising story. Or would it? Originally slated to be a reboot of the Dead Rising franchise, but ended up turning into the 4th game in the series. Dead Rising 4 released on December 6th, 2016 for Xbox One and Windows. Additionally, Dead Rising 4 would bring back photojournalist and zombie killer extraordinaire Frank West, but not entirely as we remember him, which was one of the many issues that surrounded this game. The events of Dead Rising 4 take place during the Christmas season of 2022, and 1 year after the events of Dead Rising 3. For those counting, this would be 16 years after the events of the original Dead Rising. And with that being said, the years had apparently been very kind to protagonist Frank West, as he came back looking like the twin brother of Nathan Drake, instead of the rough, gritty, unattractive hero that fans came to love. The gameplay of Dead Rising 4 also received a mixed reception, as they changed many features that made the franchise what it was, such as the removal of campaign co-op and more streamlined controls. Additionally, they removed the timer system, which also removed the tense feeling that was present in many of the other games. While the return of the franchise king should have been a massive success, it ended up feeling a little bit hollow, with a story that wasn't really that memorable. And while the action and gameplay felt exhilarating at times, it lost a lot of what made Dead Rising special. Dead Rising 4 would end up with mixed reviews from critics, and by 2017 would sell less than 1 million copies of the game, and ultimately miss Capcom's goal of 2 million copies sold, and would make Dead Rising 4, at least statistically speaking, a failure in the franchise. On top of various remakes and spin-offs like Dead Rising 2 Off the Record, the Dead Rising franchise also contained comics and movies that many fans of the franchise may not have known about. One of these, which we discussed briefly, was the Road to Fortune comic series that was released after Dead Rising 2. This 4-comic series helped give more backstory to Chuck Green, as well as insight on what happened to Frank West after the events of Dead Rising. In addition to the comic, a number of movies were also released that take place within the Dead Rising universe, with 2 being canon and the other being, well, this. For those wondering, yes, this was real and was actually written and directed by Keiji Inafune, the creator of the Dead Rising franchise. This gem that was lost to time is called Zombrex Dead Rising Sun, and was actually a film series that was released on Xbox Live Marketplace ahead of the release of Dead Rising 2, and was actually included with the Zombrex edition of the Dead Rising 2 game. While Zombrex Dead Rising Son was not canon to the overall Dead Rising storyline, the other two films that were created did actually fall in line with the events of the game and are canon to the series. Dead Rising Watchtower and Dead Rising Endgame were set between the events of Dead Rising 2 and Dead Rising 3 and follows the reporter Chase Carter. Both of these movies were released on Crackle, with Watchtower coming out in 2015 and Endgame released the following year. Both movies received very mixed reviews, but in my own opinion, in terms of video game adaptations, they weren't really all that bad. Obviously, give them a watch yourself and let us know how you feel about them. Additionally, Watchtower and Endgame gave us a lot of fun Easter eggs that we see throughout the Dead Rising franchise. It also gave us live action versions of Frank West and Chuck Green, with Chuck being portrayed by Victor Webster and Frank being portrayed by the always funny Rob Riggle. So there have clearly been a lot of swings given to the Dead Rising franchise, and while most led to home runs, there were a few creations that just didn't land. On the video game side, Dead Rising 4 was the last Dead Rising game with new content that fans experienced. However, there were rumors of a fifth entry in the series plan that would revolve around Chuck and Katie, set between the events of Dead Rising 2 and Dead Rising 3, but was cancelled when Capcom Vancouver shut down in 2018. The closest thing to a new Dead Rising project that fans have received is the recent Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster, which completely remastered Dead Rising onto the new RE engine, and honestly made it feel more like a remake than a remaster, including new and improved graphics, quality of life changes, new voice actors for every single character, and so much more. The Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster gave us the 2006 classic in an all-new format that made me personally feel like I was playing a new game while also experiencing the nostalgia of my childhood. So how will Dead Rising move forward? Well, we could see a reboot like what was originally planned for Dead Rising 4, or maybe we could see the return of Chuck Green, like the rumors surrounding the scrapped Dead Rising 5. And if the Deluxe Remaster proves to be a massive success, we could potentially see more remasters for the other games in the Dead Rising series. But really only time will tell what Dead Rising's future looks like. How would you like to see Capcom continue the Dead Rising franchise? Let us know, and thank you for watching Game Rant. Don't forget to game on, and we'll see you next time.